The tragedy and heartache behind closed doors in rural China. 4 youngsters are found dead next to a suicide note, highlighting the plight of the millions of children left behind by parents in poverty seeking work in the cities. The human cost of making ends meet. This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. I want to start this Inside Story by reading you a letter. It was written by a 14-year-old boy in China. He'd been abandoned first by his mother and then his father, who left him and his 3 younger sisters to look for work. This is what he said. "Thanks for the good intentions. I know you are good to me, but it is time for me to go. I swore I would not live beyond 15 years old, and death has been my dream for years." Well, that boy and his sisters were later found dead after drinking pesticide. Shocking and tragic, of course, but also highlighting the problems faced by the millions of families in China and worldwide, driven by poverty and torn apart when one or both parents go off to find work in big cities or abroad. Our China correspondent, Adrian Brown, reports from the southwestern province of Guangzhou.
It's a landscape that offers some of the most beautiful scenery in China, but it's also a region now synonymous with tragedy and poverty. This is the house where police say 4 young children, 3 sisters and a brother, committed suicide last month after being abandoned by their parents, both migrant workers. They swallowed pesticide. The youngest was 5. Their death has highlighted the plight of China's so-called left-behind children.
Those 4 children, what they ate was worse than the food you give to pigs. Raw corn every day. No one took care of them.
She is vague about why no one here seems to have raised the alarm sooner. This case is about more than just poverty. It also concerns the issue of child welfare in China and raises a number of troubling questions. How is it possible for 4 children to live in this house for so long without anyone? A neighbour, a teacher at the local school, the police, local government officials not realising what was going on. One of the reasons, there's simply nothing unusual about children living apart from their parents in today's China. Chang Chi's 2 grandchildren live with her because her son works hundreds of kilometres away. She says their mother left 5 years ago to escape the poverty all around them.
She went back to her hometown. She thought life was too hard and poor here. She doesn't want to come back.
Poverty is a sensitive issue in China, which is why local government officials were soon onto us, following our every movement. They were worried because President Xi Jinping had been in this same province a few days earlier, telling people that poverty was nothing to fear. We were, though, allowed to visit Lushu Village School. Out of its 93 students, we were told around 20 live with their relatives, grandparents mostly. Strict rules to control the flow of people mean they only see their parents once a year. Before we talked to the teacher, our minders spoke to her.
It is not a big problem because most of the children can talk to their parents by phone once a day. In the worst case, it's once a week.
A poster with an urgent message: build up confidence to battle poverty. In the city of Bijie, they're constructing new factories and offices that, in theory, could one day provide jobs that could help keep local families together. The deaths of 4 children last month is a reminder of why such an investment can't come soon enough. Adrian Brown, Al Jazeera in southwest China.
We will get to our broader discussion in just a moment. First, though, I'd like to run through a few examples of the many people who are driven to seek work beyond their shores. The Philippines is the source of nearly 3 million migrants here in this region. Many are women working in the service sector who've had to leave their children behind. There are more than 4 million undocumented Mexican women living in the United States. Again, most of them leaving to provide for their children back home. And it's estimated that half of the men in the Malabar region of the Indian state of Kerala work in the Middle East, leaving more than 1 million so-called Gulf wives back home, living solitary lives away from their husbands, basically widows. Someone who is from Kerala and working here in Qatar joins me now, Shajeer Hussein. Shajeer left behind his wife and child in India about 6 years ago and works here as a taxi driver in Doha. And we appreciate you joining us, Shajeer. In that 6 years that you've been here, have you been able to go back home and visit your family?
Yeah, every year, once in every year.
Once a year, is that enough?
No.
No, not enough. So have they been able to come here to see you?
Yeah, right this moment, they're here. They just came before 4 months. So 1 more month, they will be stay here. Then they're back home.
So that's 5 months that you get to see your wife and your son.
Yeah.
How difficult is it going to be to say goodbye to them?
Really, I can't bye to them.
How old is your son?
Just 2.
Just 2. He's little. So tell me about the decision to leave home and come here. How did you make that decision?
You mean?
I mean, what was it? The money? Like, what made you pick this place to come to?
I thought getting enough money in Qatar. That's why. And also my brother's working here. That's why I come to easy here.
But was it a hard decision?
Difficult without a family. That's a main problem.
Are they ever going to move here and live forever, or are you always going to be separated?
I like to bring them forever, but I can't. So my income is not enough to live here for my family.
There's so many other people that are in these really, really difficult situations. What would you say to someone else who's a parent who says, I could never, ever leave my family? What would you say to them? It's not that easy, is it?
Yeah, that's not easy.
But has it been the right decision for your family?
Yeah, I'm also saying I can't live here without family, but unfortunately,
you're doing the best you can.
Yeah.
You're doing the best you can. Well, Shajeer, thank you so much for telling me about your family. I know it's not easy to talk about missing them, but I am glad you've been able to have the last 4 months with them.
Thank you.
And 1 more month, right?
One more month, yeah.
All right, Shajeer, thank you very much for the conversation.
Welcome. Thank you. Bye.
Let's bring in our other guests now for this Inside Story. Joining us from Nottingham is Steve Tsang, Senior Fellow at the China Policy Institute at Nottingham University. And in Geneva, we have Joe Lowry, the Asia-Pacific spokesperson for the International Organization for Migration. So families being separated for economic reasons, economic financial hardship, that's not new. But what is driving the spike in these numbers? Steve, I want to start with you.
Well, what we are dealing with in China is a sheer matter of scale. The industrialization and the urbanization of China in the last 30 years has simply been phenomenal. And therefore, we are talking about hundreds of millions of workers who used to work on the land, now working in factories across the whole country in China. And therefore, we are talking about tens of millions of children who are being left behind in villages while their parents are working a long way from home.
Okay, those numbers are huge, and we're going to drill down on those numbers in just a moment. Clearly, China and India are dealing with this, but other countries are also in the same situation and that are really affected by this. Joe, could you touch on that for me? What are some of the other countries that are caught in this cycle?
Well, migration is the world's oldest poverty reduction strategy. So it's not, of course, there are countries where there's rapid urbanization, but there's also countries where people are just are in grinding poverty, and it's much easier to travel the world nowadays. There's much more connections and connectivity, and also people can find out through social media where the jobs are. They can connect very easily with their relatives overseas. So the news about opportunity spreads very quickly as well. But certainly there are some major hotspots. The Philippines, you mentioned, would be one in this region, and Nepal would be another, and also in parts of the former Soviet Union, in Central Asia, in countries like Moldova and also Belarus and Ukraine, many people going to Russia to work, not long epic journeys perhaps like we're seeing from the Philippines to the Gulf countries, but still far enough so that they can almost over time begin a second life when they're away from their family, no matter how much they may miss them and how easy it is perhaps through Skype and mobile telephony to get in contact with their family. Over time, unfortunately, they can't get home very often, and it becomes a case of out of sight and out of mind. And then we do see these tragic scenarios and stories evolving that we saw in China recently.
Let's take a look now at the number of children involved in China in a little more detail. There are an estimated 60 million so-called left behind children in China. The numbers have soared by 150% in the past 5 years. To put that in some perspective, that's equivalent to the entire population of Italy. 3 to 4 million under the age of 6 are said to be living in extreme poverty, often forced to fend for themselves. Research shows nearly 13 million children have stunted growth, while many children tested in rural areas suffered from anemia or lack of iron. Steve, does China have a grasp of how bad this problem is?
Well, the Chinese government is very much aware of the scale and the extent of the problem. And to be fair, the Chinese government has also tried very hard to deal with the problems that they actually found. And if you were interviewing a Chinese government official, he or she would tell you how many hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of poverty in China in the last 20 years. But that's not going to affect the 60 millions that we talk about. Those children are still in that dire strait, and what the government are doing often are not enough to redress the fundamental problems that these children face day in, day out.
So there's a few different scenarios. There's scenarios where a parent leaves to go to another country and they leave their children behind. And what's happening in China is the parents aren't actually leaving the country. They're just going to a different part of the country and leaving their children behind. I think, Steve, most people would want to know, why can't they just bring their children with them?
Well, this is a very specific problems that China, under the Communist Party, faces. The irony is that for the small number of Chinese who actually work overseas, and if they earn enough money, they often can bring their families to move to that foreign country with them. But in China, the Chinese government imposes a household registration system by which if you were born in a rural village, you will have a rural registration and you will not be able to get an urban registration even if you spend 10, 20, 30 years working as a migrant worker in a major city like Shanghai or Beijing.
So no chance of upward mobility for these families or their children?
Well, there's very little chance of those families being able to move the families in with them in the city where they work and put those children through normal state-funded schools in the area and in that sense earn social mobility. But that is not to say that there is completely no social mobility in China, because what we see is that people moving from working on the lands to working in factories and providing some kind of education to their left behind children, however poor the quality of the education may be, is still giving them a slightly better lot than what they previously had working simply on the land without even those extra income being earned in the factories far away from home.
Okay. Joe, we're talking a lot about children being left behind, and we'll continue to, but in so many cases as well, women are left behind because it's their husbands that go to another country. What are the challenges, the risks in a situation like that where women are left behind?
women are left behind, but actually we talk a lot about the feminization of migration. And in fact, the numbers are about 48% of international migrants are women. And we also find, while I'm mentioning this, that women send back about the same amount of money as men do, but they send back money more often, and their money is used, it's very critical when emergencies strike. But if men are absent, women back at home, then obviously they're looking after a family without a male parent present as well. And they're often, one thing we're very concerned about for families being brought up by one parent is the breakup of that family and other relationships being formed while one spouse is overseas or back home. And it happens very, very regularly. Let's say it does happen a lot, even though the family may have been strong beforehand. It is very difficult once a family is broken up. So what we'd like to see more of is better managed migration, people able to migrate for short periods of time to earn the money they need to build that house, to pay those school fees, to pay that hospital bill they need to do. And most people who are migrating don't really want to leave their home unless they're leaving for reasons of persecution. This is where they're from, this is where their roots are, and their families have lived for generations, and they would probably like to stay there where it's safe enough to do so and where there are economic opportunities. And one story I remember being very struck by was a young man in India called Hassan, who was saving up to buy a boat. He went to the nearby city, worked hard to buy a boat. He was smart enough to realize that if he had a boat, when the floods came, he could take his livestock and his possessions up to safety. And as the flood waters went down, he'd be the first person back in the village and able to start farming again and reoccupy his house. So he just wanted to leave, have enough money to get married and buy that boat. Once he'd worked for a few months, he was able to come back and start life as a comparatively wealthy member of that community. And I think that's what drives many people, is just to leave, to earn the money they need to get through one episode of life, be it a marriage, be it building a house, be it a health problem. But unfortunately, people have to pay a lot of money to brokers, to middlemen, to the grey market, or to smugglers to get themselves to areas where there are jobs. And they frequently end up working for 6 months or even much longer to pay back the debts they incurred.
So it's really a vicious cycle. It's a hole that they dig themselves in. I do want to ask one more question, though, about the situation specifically pertaining to women. Depending on the country that they're left behind in, might they be in physical danger at times as well?
Absolutely, in the country they're left behind, and of course the country they travel to. And when the sort of soft form of trafficking, how women end up in sexual slavery, is they think very often it's a friend, a very plausible friend, who says, let's go to the nearby big city or a new country where we can work selling clothes, we can work in restaurants, we can work and then perhaps as dancers. And they very quickly find they've surrendered their passport, the door is locked behind them, and they're told, you're my property now, and you have to work for me for months until such time as you worked off your debt. So they can be in danger at home on their own without a male perhaps to look out for them. They can be in danger while they're traveling, and they can certainly be in danger when they arrive somewhere. So immigration, a female migration path is very, very fraught.
Really no good options, unfortunately. Steve, what are Chinese officials trying to do about this? I mean, a situation where these poor children were unattended for so long. Are there laws against that?
No, there are no laws which are against parents leaving their children behind. The social services in China is very different from what you found in, say, Western Europe, like the United Kingdom, where you have social services checking on children in that kind of situation. There simply are not that kind of laws. The Chinese government are trying to address the symptoms of problems like particular cases like these, then they will be giving a lot of attention to it. But the most basic fundamental problem that gives rise to this situation is the household registration system, which prohibits rural families from, in effect, migrating from their villages into cities and towns where they can then have a new life and live their life like a normal citizen in those urban centers and enjoy the same access to education and health services and other utilities in those places.
And Steve, so if I can stop you for just a moment as you're talking, I just want our viewers to know what it is they're looking at. They're looking at the home, the place where these 4 children were found dead, just to really drive home the point of how dire this situation is. And please do continue your point.
And if the families were being allowed to live in the urban centers as family units, then a lot of those problems that we saw in the suicide of the 4 children may not happen. Because what we are dealing with here is not just a matter of poverty and depravity. We are dealing with young children who felt they were left behind, they were abandoned by their parents. They don't have love. They don't have that relationship with their parents. That's why they actually resort to very desperate measures like that. And you cannot redress that simply by increasing the salaries for migrant workers, or simply say we will provide better schools in the villages so that children will get better education. I mean, all these are helpful and positive, but they will not address the most fundamental problem, which is the forced separation of parents from their children.
Let's talk numbers now and remittances, because families do this. They split up with the intention to try to send money back home. So let's look at some of these numbers as it pertains to remittances. The latest figures from the World Bank estimate 247 million people worldwide live in countries where they were not born. Now, within that group, migrants sent home $436 billion in remittances to the developing world last year. To put that in perspective, that's almost 3 times as much as the combined amount of development aid sent by wealthy nations, around $135 billion. So my question to you, Joe, is do countries really have any motivation to change the circumstances that are driving this if they eventually get the money back?
Well, I'm not sure if the countries get the money back, but the families get the money back, hopefully. And also, unfortunately, quite a lot is skimmed off by agencies that send the money back, which is something we're concerned about. But ideally, the money should be going back into communities for the families. Most migrants say that they're working overseas to feed their family, to clothe their family, to educate their family, and perhaps to shelter their family. So, of course, migration should be made safe, and it should be made an option, and not something that people absolutely have to do. Migration should be, in an ideal world, of course we don't live in an ideal world, but it should be a choice people make freely, and it shouldn't be permanent unless they wish it to be so.
There's in the United States, a United States senator from the state of Louisiana has proposed something called the Remittance Status Verification Act of 2015. And basically what that would do is if you are living in the United States and you are sending money to another country, you have to be able to prove that you're in the United States legally. And if not, you will be fined. Is that something that has been explored in other countries? And what would the effects of something like that be on economic migrants? Joe, tell me more about that.
Well, I can't comment on that specific case. You say it's only proposed, but certainly in the area that I'm working in, I think that economies would grind to a halt without migrant labourers. Migrant labour, working in the seafood industry, working in tourism, working in all sorts of jobs that the well-off, perhaps the middle-class members of society in those countries simply don't want to do. So, migration really drives the world economy, not just a national economy, and it's also interlinked. Migration it affects the sending country, the receiving country, and of course the migrants themselves. So it is. We say that migration is the mega trend of the 21st century, and I think it's certainly turning out to be, because the world is. Economies are growing, booming and busting, and it's so much more easy to travel around. And there's also so many of us on this planet, and we no longer feel that we have to work in one place, but we do feel that our home in one place is in one place. So we have this dichotomy that we might feel quite happy working overseas, but we do also have a strong attachment to where we're from, and that's why people, and those are the communities that benefit from remittances. So I think any attempt to overtax or over-control the flow of remittances would probably be counterproductive.
Joe, I think you said it best when you said that migration really drives the global economy, and in an ideal situation, it needs to be safe and temporary. Thank you both for the conversation. Joe Lowry and Steve Tsang and Shajeer Hussein, who joined us earlier at the top of the show. Thank you. And thank you, too, for watching. As always, we welcome your thoughts. You can get in touch via our program page on aljazeera.com. You can also post comments at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story or tweet us at AJ Inside Story. From me, Richelle Carey, and the entire team here, goodbye for now.